She's here to get us and keep us in line. So Michelle and I met with her for a little bit earlier this afternoon just to go through some stuff from our end. So she's just going to kind of run through some things. If you guys have questions for her, this is just kind of an informal deal. So
I already asked her my one question, is if we could have a copy of these slides.
Yeah.
I mean, at home with
Definitely.
popcorn. This
In
will be fun.
fact, she downloaded it on this computer, so
Oh,
you
okay,
can take it
perfect.
off this, or
Yep.
I can email it to you
no,
later.
that's fine if she downloaded it already, and then we can send it out tomorrow.
So I kind of have two parts to this tonight. One is just a refresher of the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is the green book. And then I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about some grant funding we have and just throw out some ideas. That way, if the city wants to apply for some funding and there's some other options to that, if you guys have projects you want to work on, we have the grant money for it. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware of that.
Hey, Michelle,
Yeah.
Michelle,
So
can we have a piece of paper, please?
yes. So you guys do project reviews under a couple of different laws, and we went over that today just to make sure we were clear. There's a local ordinance that the city of Leavenworth has to protect historic resources that are listed at the local level. And then we have state and national register listed properties that are reviewed under the state preservation law, which we have an agreement with the city for you guys to do those reviews. No matter how you're reviewing a project, you're always using one of these Secretary of the Interior standards. And the Park Service, which is under the Department of the Interior, sets up 4 different standards, one for preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. The vast majority of what you see, I see, are rehabilitation projects. We generally don't see preservation or restoration unless it's like a museum or a historic site, like where it's for tourism, where they're really trying to portray what it looked like in the past. Reconstruction would be where something's completely missing and you're trying to reconstruct it from scratch. Rehabilitation is what, like this building is, where it's a historic building, but it's been upgraded for continued use. So we all don't have to go to the outhouse, we don't have to go out, cook outside or anything, or use coal burning lamps. It's been rehabilitated for continued use, but it's still a historic building. So the green books I passed around, those are the guidelines to the standards for rehabilitation.
Okay.
We're going to go through the standards, which are there's just 10 of them, and I think that's on one of the first pages. The rest of that book is more do's and don'ts, or recommended and not recommended treatments for different aspects of historic properties. So there's a section on roofs and masonry and storefronts. That way, if you have a particular project that you're looking at where you need to get a little bit more clarity on, well, what does the standards say about windows? You can go to the window section and see a little bit more detail. But rehabilitation is just the act or the process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair and alterations, additions sometimes, while you preserve the aspects or portions or features that make it historic in the first place. So just like this building, the City Hall, from the outside, you've got all of the historic masonry, the glazed tile. Throughout the interior of the building, you see like the casework, the handrails, the stairs. But in other parts of the building where there weren't historic materials left, or those materials were deteriorated, they've been replaced or repaired with things that are a little bit more modern, like in this, this room, for example. And you do it in a way that is compatible to the historic materials. So it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, doesn't look fake historic, but it's something in between or somewhere in the middle. So there are 10 standards, and I always kind of make a joke about it. There's the 10 Bill of Rights, there's the 10 Commandments. These are the 10 standards, right? Because 10 is a nice round number. Standard number 1, and they kind of go in order, like number 1, you should use a property for a use that's basically not going to require so much change that you're really just destroying the building, right? So I always use the example, if you have a Victorian house, you can't make that into a parking garage without destroying everything that makes the Victorian house what it was, right? But if you had a warehouse, a concrete warehouse that was just big open floor space, you could use that for a parking garage. In fact, a lot of times we've seen properties do that. These are just a couple of sort of bad examples where, you know, the use of the building required a more enclosed storefront. And by enclosing that storefront, they've really, you know, modified these buildings to the point where it's made a significant impact on their historic character. So the use of the property may not have been the best, you know, choice for these particular buildings. A different building for that use or a different use for that building may have been better. This is just another example we've seen. I use this one sometimes because the building on the left is a drinking establishment, a bar, and city codes in that particular community say that bars can't have windows that are transparent to the street. And that was going to cause a problem with this historic building because you can see the very large, tall display windows that are original to that building. Of course, as preservation folks, we would not have wanted those to be enclosed or downsized. They were able to do something different with that building and just use vinyl, like sticker signage to cover up the glass. So it met the code, but it also didn't ruin or desecrate any of the historic materials. So sometimes the use can either be modified or the treatment can be modified so that it doesn't harm the historic building.
So they can literally do whatever they want as long as they don't destroy the underlying historical part?
I mean, in a certain way, we're going to go through the rest of the standards, but yeah, I mean, that's the key is like do no harm,
Okay.
basically, yeah.
But again, then it still has to also be in line with our development regulations too.
Yeah, I mean, it has to meet codes and things, so in a different community, this may not be possible. And we may have to look at other alternatives, and if other alternatives don't exist, then that could be a problem.
Sure.
This bar may not be a good use for this building in another community.
Well, but by the same token, that may not be a bar 10 years from now.
Exactly, and that's the
So all you have to
point.
do is peel off the
Right.
vinyl,
That's a good
and
deal.
you're right
Right.
back to historical.
Whereas these properties, if this isn't a Pizza Hut anymore, now you've got a major change that the next occupant is gonna have to undo all of that, and the historic material is lost and gone, and it can't be brought back. Yep, exactly. Standard number 2 says that historic character of a property should be retained and preserved. We're just, you know, reiterating the same thing, basically. But removal of historic materials and alterations of features and spaces that characterize a property should be avoided. So you can kind of see at the top of this building, something's obviously missing, right? This is an example of a building, and I saw one today earlier where a metal facade was installed at some point. And, you know, there were these pesky little things that were pointing out of the top of it, and they just cut them off. And so when the metal facade was removed, now it's missing its top. And I'll show you a picture later of how that was restored. But I want to point out in this one, too, that it says not just features, but also spaces. So in buildings that have public spaces, like the City Hall here, the main corridors, in a school, the corridors, the auditorium or gymnasium may have big open spaces. A church would be another example where the main impact or the main use of that building was the congregation, the sanctuary space. You wouldn't want to cut that up or divide it or make major changes to it that are going to really impact the character of the building. So we try to maintain those spaces that characterize the building as well, not just the individual features, because if you went into a historic theater and divided it up into apartment building, you know, apartments, all of the plaster and stuff might be there, but when you walk in that building, it sure doesn't look like a theater anymore, right? So the space is important too. Standard number 3 just kind of builds onto that same idea that each property should be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. So changes that create false sense of historic development, such as adding conjectural features or elements from other buildings, should not be undertaken. My boss calls this Buckaroo Revival, where they've tried to, like, this was kind of a theme in, I think, the 70s and 80s, where it was almost like they tried to make it more old-timey, right? And this particular town, I mean, there were communities in Kansas in the Cowtown era that had sort of, wood awnings on the buildings, but those pretty much burned down and were replaced with masonry buildings with pressed metal facades and, beautiful cornices and things. They never would have had unpainted shake shingles on the front of them, right? So one of the things we always think about too when we're reviewing projects and why do we even do preservation, why do we even like historic properties, is that to me they're the physical, tangible connection to our past, right? So if something's fake, if it's not authentic, if it's been replaced to be, more old-timey, then you lose that tangible connection. So putting, fake wood or something over the top of something doesn't make it more historic. It actually reduces the integrity of the building. And then this is just an example of something that's kind of the opposite. These are buildings that would have never had, striped canvas awnings or wood shake awnings. These are mid-20th century buildings that, if they had awnings at all, would have had a flat metal, low profile, very sleek and modern. And so, if you're doing a review of a downtown building, let's say, and all these are commercial properties, I just did that for ease of discussion today, but all these same standards apply to homes and theaters and churches and everything else. But if you were doing a review on one of these projects and, typically in your downtown, you might recommend a property owner install a canvas awning on their 1880s, cute little Italianate building, which you guys have a lot of those in Leavenworth. But let's say that one at the bottom was smack in the middle of your downtown. You wouldn't want to recommend the same kind of awning on that building because it's a completely different building. So what fits 90% of the buildings may not fit that other 10%. And every building has to be kind of looked at as its own thing. This just goes along with that misconception that sometimes being more old-timey is better. So by the time Kansas was settled, large panes of glass were pretty much readily available. So very few buildings had multi-light windows like this. And that's more of a colonial era or early 19th century look. But you do see this sometimes on storefronts and things where people are like, oh, I'll make it look more colonial. Well, Kansas was settled in like the 1840s and 50s and things, so a masonry building like this would not have had those, except for I'll show you some exceptions to the rule, because there's always exceptions, right? So there's an exception on the left. Standard number 4 says that properties change over time, and those changes that have acquired historic significance should be retained and preserved. So we're actually not looking at the building on the left, which was I think it was a telegraph office in Hutchinson. I'm actually looking at the building in the middle, which is the Pickies department store. That building was built in the 19-teens, and it had this very beautiful ornate masonry facade with lots of decorative elements that were sort of applied to it in terracotta. 1950s roll around, we've got to update and modernize our department store, right? So they completely shaved all of that off, infilled the windows, and put this metal facade on there, and also redid the entire inside of the department store with 1950s pink tile, chrome. It's gorgeous, actually. But the key to understanding this is that even though we have historic photos of what that building looked like in the 19-teens, this is a 1950s building now. Even if the property owner wanted to go back to the 19-teens and wanted to spend all that money to undo the 1950s, this is now the authentic, real history of this building. Everything you touch on that building is 1950s. And so by ripping all that out and then installing fake 1900s, replica things, you're actually diminishing the building's historic integrity. So we wouldn't recommend that. We would always recommend retaining what's authentic and historic. Some of the mid-century slip covers you see, may or may not be significant, but sometimes design changes like these are a little bit more involved and probably should be preserved. Unfortunately, that yellow one on the bottom has not been preserved. Somebody drastically altered that one. And the architect who designed that building was actually still alive, and he was okay with it. He thought it was great, and we were like, okay, well, that's fine. Standard number 5 says that distinctive features, finishes, construction techniques, examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property should also be preserved. So sometimes things like that are hidden. They might be very tiny details. They might be just the construction of the wall that's not even visible to the public. But where possible, those things should be preserved when they can be. One thing, this is just an example, is prismatic glass. It's becoming very rare and hard to find. So if you do have a storefront that has prismatic glass, that's one thing that we try very hard to get property owners to preserve, because there's just not that much of it around anymore. There are a few places that have either replica glass pieces or salvage that they can use to repair them. And then standard number 6, I feel like this is the one that sort of where the rubber meets the road and most people know, okay, this is what we're talking about when we review projects. So when something is deteriorated, you have a historic feature that's deteriorated, you should repair it rather than replace it. But when the severity of the deterioration requires replacement, then we look at the new feature matching the old in design, color, texture, and when possible, materials. The materials aren't always possible, so that's okay as long as it meets the visual match. And replacement of missing features should be documented with either photographs, drawings, or some kind of documentary evidence. So going back to that picture a while ago where the things on the top were missing, they had historic photos to replicate those, and I'll show you an example here in a little bit. But windows, for example, are a big thing. We always get reviews. You guys probably have seen reviews too, where people are, I need to replace my windows. So it's actually a process we need to go through. First, can they be repaired? Well, first, are they historic windows or are they already replacement windows? That is a good question to start with. They're historic windows, can they be repaired? If not, then what do you want to replace them with? So you have to kind of work through the steps. Because if someone just comes and says, I need to replace my windows, you don't want to get bogged down in the details of, well, what new windows look like, that kind of thing, if you haven't answered the first question of, are they beyond repair? Do you guys have any questions about that necessarily? That's sort of the big one that we always deal with. So this is another exception to the rule where you do have multi-light windows in a historic theater, but it's pointing out historic documentation and also changes over time. So we have a historic photo of this theater that substantiates the window did have multi-light windows originally, that 2 little storefronts. But if this property owner came to us and said, well, I want to restore that, one of the questions I would have is when were the changes in the top photo undertaken? Because if that was done in the 1950s or 60s, then that means that's within the historic period of the historic district or maybe the property listing. So it could be that those changes have become historic in their own right. And then it's up to us as the reviewers to decide if that is something that is significant that needs to be kept. Or is it something that was done in the 80s to look old and it's really not that historic, it's not that significant, and it would actually be better for them to go ahead and restore it back to the photograph. If they didn't have the photograph, it would be very hard for them to do a restoration because they would be just sort of guessing and it would be conjectural. And so it would be better to keep what they have probably and modify it rather than try to make something up.
So have they done any research behind that facade that's up there for a theater to say all of that gingerbread is still there?
That's a good question, and I would definitely ask that question and encourage them to do that, because it does kind of, this photo isn't great, it's not detailed, but it does kind of look like they just put something white over it, and maybe it's stucco or some sort of fiberboard or something, and it might just be covering up what's there already. Because it looks like there's a door approximately where the historic door used to be on the right. So some of that might still be under there, yeah. And don't feel bad about asking questions to the property owner. You can always ask them to do some investigation. Ask them to bring you samples of the material they want to use, that kind of thing. That's perfectly legitimate. So there's the building. So because they had historic documentation, and obviously it's pretty evident that, you know, two peaks come up, they would have met in the middle. But because they had that, they were able to replicate those top pieces for that building, which makes a world of difference. Standard number 7 is another one that I think most people pretty much understand by now. Chemical or physical treatments like sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials should not be used. And when you have to clean a structure, which is very rare, it needs to be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. And that really goes for other treatments as well. It goes back to the do no harm thought process. If there's something you're going to be applying or treating a building, you want to make really sure that it's not going to make the problem worse or cause some other problem. And sandblasting or any kind of aggressive cleaning of a building will definitely cause damage. It can actually cause the building to just melt away. This is, the bottom is shown some testing that was being done on the state capitol in Topeka. They used different treatments and then decided which one was going to be the treatment that they were going to use. Most buildings don't need to be cleaned unless the dirt is causing damage, so like it's biological growth or something that's actually eating into the building. Or if you're going to be doing repairs and you need a clean surface so that the repairs stick, or you can like match the color or something. But otherwise, just because the building is dirty, I mean, it's 100 years old, it's not going to look new. So it's better not to clean it unless it really is necessary, because you could damage it. Standard number 8 is one that we don't think about very often, but it is in there, and it's something that I bring up to property owners every now and then. So archaeological resources do tend to be around or go along with the historic resources that we review. So if there's a project that's involving some sort of digging, like maybe foundation repairs or a new water line or something like that, it's not a bad idea to just kind of bring up the idea to the property owner that, hey, if you happen to run across anything in your yard, it might be of interest to somebody like the local historical society or the archaeologists in my office. Typically, they're not going to be too worried about it unless it's some amazing artifact that like we've never seen before. But it could add to the history of your property to know a little bit more about who lived there, worked there, what kind of industries were happening in that neighborhood. You know, it could lead to all kinds of different interesting findings. So we always point that out, that if there is something that you come across, you can definitely call our office. We have archaeologists in our office that could help. I had a call this morning. That guy thought he found a cannonball in his yard. He doesn't live too far from Lecompton, so maybe, we don't know. I sent it to the archaeologist.
Do we have any archaeological things going on here with our underground?
Oh, with the tunnels?
Yeah, or anything, I
Yeah,
guess.
I don't know if that would be considered.
I don't know. We can look up. I mean, there are archaeological sites all
Just
along the
popped in my
rivers
head.
and the creeks and stuff. Some of them are listed on the National Register, but we don't usually hear very much about them because they're just underground and they just sit there. But we were talking earlier about federal preservation law. So if there is a federal agency that's doing something like a highway or a bridge or cell towers now, they have to make sure that they're not disturbing archaeological resources, and so they do contact us to make sure.
Okay.
So standards number 9 and 10 both deal with additions, new construction, new changes to a historic building. 9 says that additions, alterations, new construction should not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. Okay, that seems self-evident. New work should be differentiated from the old and compatible with the massing, size, scale, and features, and the integrity of the property and its environment. So there's a lot in that second part, and it can be difficult to kind of maneuver. Architects often have questions about that because it's like, well, how do I make it differentiated and compatible? And I'll show you an example in a minute that may help with that, but it can be difficult. My boss tends to think that this sometimes makes architecture very vanilla because you try not to rock the boat by going either way, and it ends up being sort of bland. But I think there's a way to do it on a lot of projects. This is sort of a bad example that turns into a good example. This is in Hutchinson. The storefront on the bottom left, you can see probably in the 70s or 80s was modified for a new use and kind of back to the standard number 1, like what were they doing? I don't know. But they took out all the historic materials of the storefront other than the cast iron columns. And, you know, this destroyed historic materials. It's not compatible. It's very differentiated, I'll give it that. But it's not compatible with the massing, size, scale of the building at all. So we would not recommend this treatment. But when new property owners wanted to restore it, they didn't necessarily have historic photos, but storefronts of this era tend to be pretty similar with a bulkhead, big display windows, and then a transom. And so they had the one on the right to kind of work off of, which had been modified as well. But they had the doors, and they had obviously marks on the building from where the historic windows had been. And so they were able to do something that was compatible, even though they didn't have a photo to restore from. And then the standard also applies to new construction. So if you have a hole, let's say in your downtown or in a historic district where a new building is going to be built, the same thing applies. Massing, size, scale, setback, materials. So in a downtown like Lawrence, where there is a historic building on the right and the American Eagle Outfitters building is an infill, a 10-story high-rise would not have been compatible there. Setting it back 20 feet with parking in the front would not have been a compatible new infill. Different materials may not have been compatible. Now, just looking at the scale of the windows and some of the other things, it's pretty obvious this is new construction. It's not trying to fool anybody. So it's differentiated, I think, but that's one example. And then standard number 10 is more about additions and adjacent new construction and how it should be undertaken in a manner that does not cause the essential form and integrity of the historic property environment to be impaired. So this is an example of a little Carnegie Library in Lincoln, Kansas, where they needed some additional space, like a lot of little Carnegie libraries do, and they did an addition with what we call a hyphen, which just barely touches the building at the back. They utilized existing window openings to create doorways. And then the new addition meets standard number 9 as well, because it's differentiated but also compatible. They use the same materials, but they made it lower. They scooted it in from the sides a little bit, so from the front you can't see the addition at all. And then some of the windows and things, they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. So this is an example we use for that. And then one note, this is kind of a problem in bigger cities, but we see it sometimes. We had a project in Manhattan that became a little bit controversial for a rooftop addition. And so sometimes, especially in downtowns, you may have a 2-story building and they want to put another 2 stories on top of it. And depending on codes, that may or may not be allowed. But that's one thing that the standards do address, is that that's the same thing as doing an addition on the building to the back or the side. It has to be compatible. It has to be massing, size, scale compatible. And typically, a 2-story building can't accept a rooftop addition because it always is gonna look like it has a hat on it. Whereas if you had a taller building, 4 stories maybe, you could definitely do an addition, because it could be set back enough that you wouldn't even be able to see it from the street. But other things when you're reviewing projects that aren't necessarily addressed in the standards, but there's a little bit more guidance in the guidebook, and of course it's just something that we all kind of get a sense of the more that you review projects. Moisture's a threat to all buildings, so whenever someone has a project where they're trying to keep the moisture out, that's probably a good idea. It's just all about how they do it. And a lot of times I see projects where someone wants to do something, and my internal thought process is always, where's the water going? Because that hasn't necessarily been thought out very well, and that can cause problems later. Dark tint on glass, we always try to avoid that on like storefronts and window replacements, because you get sort of that blank look to a building, and that's not historically appropriate and compatible. Garage door openings, we have some good examples in our visual library that we can provide if anybody ever has questions. There's different ways to replace garage doors so that they are compatible and look good for the building but still meet the use of the building. Sometimes they can be replaced with something that operates, and sometimes it's just a fake something that looks like a garage door. And then I'm going to skip over that. Restrictions versus incentives. We were talking a little bit about that today. You know, there's all these laws, local laws, state laws, federal laws that have to do with preservation. But my office has also incentives, so it's a little bit of the carrot and stick situation where we try to incentivize doing it per the standards instead of trying to mandate the standards. So we do have tax credits and grants. And that's something that, as we talk next about grants from us to the city, we could also talk about utilizing some of those as pass-through grants or some kind of incentive program. So you guys have any questions about the standards? This was just more about windows and kind of an example of why matching the windows makes a big difference. You know, a lot of people would say the window on the left, oh, that looks just like the window on the right, but it doesn't really, right? So.
Well, the one on the left had to be opened
Right.
for ventilation.
Yeah, but the historic window had a vent at the bottom, and so because they put in that mealing rail, it doesn't match, yeah. And then that's another example of a vinyl window versus a wood window. The dimensions are just a little off, and it just depends on the window. You know, some buildings that may not be a big difference. It may not make that big of a deal. But on some properties, it may be it may make a major impact, and so just thinking about that. Oh, I was going to point out, so the city of Hutchinson used some of our grant funding several years ago to hire a consultant to come in. They were having a situation where the Preservation Commission was reviewing projects, let's say a window replacement project, and they would say, you know, you have a historic window or you have a historic porch column, you need to repair it. And the property owner was saying, well, I can't afford to repair it. And then it would be appealed to the city council, and the city council would say, well, we're not contractors, we're not, you know, building professionals, we don't know how much this costs. So we don't know whether to believe the property owner or not, or like we don't have any information for that. And so they hired a consultant to actually create this tool, and they did a residential and a commercial component to it. And this is actually on their website, it's free, anybody can use it. And when you open it up, it's a spreadsheet, and it's divided out on different components. So like windows, roofing, you know, foundations, whatever. And you plug in like the size of the component, so like the size of the window, and then it'll give you different options and different cost comparisons. Now this is a couple years old, it probably needs to be updated, But that's just an example of something that other communities have done. If there's a need for that, and obviously you can use theirs. I mean, Hutchinson's not that far away, so it wouldn't be that out of whack. But do you guys have any questions about projects that you review where you guys are having struggles or issues, or you're seeing lots of something? Probably in the last year it's been a little quiet.
It seems like forever since we've looked at something, but nothing just right off the top of my head, but makes me want to walk around through downtown again.
Look at some things. We were talking too about, sometimes property owners come to you and are like, well, I want what they had, and it's like, well, I don't know how they got that, but that's not appropriate for your building, or, and that's hard sometimes. Just making them understand that. The second part of this, I just wanted to kind of give you guys some ideas and just generate some discussion. My office has a funding program, which I passed around the white paper, called Historic Preservation Fund. And this is federal funding that comes to my office to help us run all of the federal programs that the National Park Service requires us to do. So the National Register of Historic Places, the Federal Tax Credit Program, federal preservation laws. And we're required to pass through 10% of our money every year to certified local governments. And there are 18 in Kansas. So, like, for example, in 2021-22, I have $1 million. So I have to pass through 10% of that to 18 communities. And so every year we have a competitive grant round, usually in the spring. I think applications are usually due in March and awarded in May. And we ask all the CLGs and anyone else who wants to apply for that money to please send in applications. The CLGs get priority. They get extra points so that we know you guys rise to the top, but we want to fund you first. But I have to pass that money through. So if only 5 CLGs apply, then all 5 of them are getting funded because I have to spend the money. If all 18 of you apply, then it might be a little bit more competitive, but usually I have money to fund everybody that applies. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of different project ideas. One idea that we were discussing earlier was resurveying the downtown historic district. So literally just going, like you said, somebody walk through downtown, take pictures, and update all the files. That probably wouldn't be that expensive and could involve some volunteer time as match. But that's one idea of something that, we could fund that, definitely. So,
What are you talking money-wise for something like that?
These grants, probably at the high end, would be $25,000 to $30,000. But that kind of project, I would assume, is maybe in the $10,000 to $15,000 range at the most.
So reasonable then,
Yeah. So the kinds of projects we can fund, and this is just these are the most common, I guess I should say, but not an exhaustive list. So survey. CLGs, one of their main things that you guys are supposed to do is survey. We talked about this earlier where it's really hard to protect historic resources if you don't know where they are, right? So knowing where the historic resources are is part of what you're supposed to do. One of the big things that this comes into play is if there's a disaster of some kind. So as soon as FEMA comes in, they want to know, one of the first things is where are the historic resources, because they have to comply with federal preservation law. And so if you can just hand over a survey or direct them to our online database, that's going to save a lot of time in them having to go out and do the work in the middle of a disaster. I always use the example of Greensburg after the tornado took out, their whole town. They came to us because we're the historical society, thinking that we would have photos or documents or something to show them what their town used to look like. We had nothing because there had been no survey. And so I just always recommend doing a survey, because even in areas of town where you don't think there are historic resources, you may be surprised. So it doesn't hurt to even just do that. We call it a windshield survey, where someone just walks or drives down the street, takes a photo of every building, records the address, and puts it into a database. That way there's at least a record. National Register nominations. So typically, we fund bigger projects, so like historic districts. If a neighborhood or a downtown, the community wanted to list a historic district. But we could also do other kinds of nominations. So Kansas City right now, they have a lot of development pressure in their downtown area. They previously did a survey of their commercial properties, and they're going to do a historic district. But along with that are a lot of church buildings that are getting very looked at by developers for tear downs. And they're worried about that. Several of them are actually owned by the city. And so they have a separate project right now where they're going to do multiple nominations for church buildings in their downtown. So especially if you guys had something where it was thematic like that. We did one here a few years ago, Feth and Feth. Yeah, so there's like a document that talks all about the Feth and Feth company. I think they were developers or architects, right? And that context document then makes it easier for people who have buildings built by or designed by Feth and Feth. They can list their property to the register under that context. So our funding paid for the context and a couple nominations. So we could help somebody add more nominations to that, or you do some other kind of thematic nomination. We've had ones where people did, they did a nomination for like churches or theaters or ethnic associations of properties or anything like that. That's sort of a theme. Preservation plans, and lower on the list you see planning for disasters. We've had communities do a preservation plan. So if you are thinking that you want to do survey, you want to do nominations, but you have no idea where to start, coming up with a preservation plan, or and it could be a component of your comprehensive plan, like a chapter, that could be something that we could fund, so that it gives you a roadmap to say, here's what we're going to do first, second, third, and gives you a little bit more, something to look at and lay out. Educational programmings. I have a CLG right now that did an activity color book for kids, and then they're following it up this summer with an educational program at the local library. So it's going to be sort of a little summer, school type program. The key on that is just it has to be preservation focused. So if it's about buildings, if it's about history, then any ideas is on the table as long as it has that focus. It could be architecture, it could be building components, anything like that. Archaeology. Conferences and trainings. I'll give you guys a couple examples of that too, but I always try to let the CLG staff know when there's going to be a conference or a training that you guys would be eligible to attend. Sometimes we have scholarship money to pay for you to go to those, or a lot of them are online now, so if it's just registration, we can pay for that. You can apply for that through your competitive grant if you'd like, but a lot of times you can just ask me, and if I have the money, I'll just give you the money. You can also host conferences or trainings. So if you thought there was something that property owners in town, contractors, somebody like that, real estate agents, maybe, training to talk about preservation, bring in a speaker or two and have like a one-day training or something for somebody. Brochures. Different communities have done walking tours or mobile app tours now, driving tours, that kind of thing, to promote your historic districts. And a lot of times they do those in coordination with other groups, so the Historical Society or the Main Street Program or the Economic Development Program. And then design guidelines. So design guidelines are something like the Secretary of Interior's rehabilitation guidelines, but they would be more specific for a particular historic district or for your community. I always use the example of if you had a historic district where the character of that district is white picket fences, then there's nothing in these guidelines that say you have to have white picket fences on a historic home, right? Because every home is different. But if you had design guidelines, they could be illustrated, they could be in whatever format you want. That would help property owners in that neighborhood kind of understand better what's expected of them. And it would make it easier for the commissioners whenever somebody comes in front of you and it's like, oh, a chain link fence. No, I'm sorry. In this historic district, these are the options that you have available. They can be these different picket styles. They can be these different materials, but it all has to be picket. It can't be something else. So kind of just all over the map as far as other ideas. I mentioned mini grants. That would be where I give the city a pool of money, let's say $30,000, and then you pass through mini grants to property owners, like $5,000 a piece. And it's for something specific, like a storefront rehab or hiring an architect or something to do plans. The city of Hutchinson a couple of years ago did a project where they used a pool of money like that, and they put an architect on retainer. And then when people came into the planning office with projects that they felt like needed some architectural assistance, then those people got free architectural assistance from that architect up to a certain amount. So like 4 hours of service or something like that. So that's a way that you could help property owners pay for things without actually having to give them like a grant. We talked about the cost comparisons tools and architecture or educational programs. If you have any kind of brochures or anything that need an update, that would be a good project. Workshops. We did a workshop in Topeka where a consultant came in and took all the vinyl siding off of a house, and there were participants who registered, paid to get all dirty and sweaty and actually rip all the vinyl off this house, and then help the property owners kind of clean it up and get it ready for paint and stuff. But it made that house so that it would be eligible as a contributor to the historic district. So it was a benefit to the property owner as well, and then it taught other people how to remove the vinyl siding appropriately without damaging anything. One thing I do recommend is if the city is not already a member of the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, that's something that we can help you pay for. It gives you a lot of membership benefits. Like this summer, they had a bunch of free webinars. And if you're a member, then you get, like, everybody on the commission gets to attend those for free. They also have a forum or a conference every other year. So in 2022, it's going to be in Cincinnati. And to me, this is one of the most beneficial conferences for preservation because it's all about local commission topics and speakers and everything like that. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, those are kind of more high level, like theoretical preservation stuff, and it's not always very helpful. For example, one of their topics that they have on their website is how to avoid being sued. Practical things that you might want to know. They have examples of things like codes of ethics and design guidelines, how to conduct a meeting. And I think I was telling you guys earlier, I think they have example ordinances and things like that, so I'll pass those along. Yeah, and this is information about Cincinnati in 2022. So if there's interest in staff or commissioners going to that conference in 2022, then you could apply for that this next spring. Work up a little budget, tell me how many people you think you're going to send and how much you think it's going to cost. And the time that folks are spending going to the conference and attending the sessions is your match. So you don't have to have other funding. These are reimbursement grants, so you do have to pay up front and then get reimbursed, but it would reimburse all that expense. This is just a couple more examples of things that other CLGs have done. So the city of Lawrence has done a couple of those multiple property documents, those context statements. They have actually done just big picture historic resources of Lawrence, 1854 to 1945, and then 45 to 75. And so if you want to list anything in the city of Lawrence, the history of Lawrence has already been written. You don't have to rewrite that. You just have to tell us about your particular house, commercial building. And it makes it a lot easier, because otherwise people kind of have to put the property in the context of the city. And you have to keep rewriting over and over again the history of Lawrence, the history of Lawrence. This makes it a lot easier for folks to do their nominations. And then the most recent project they have is they're probably one of the oldest residential historic districts in the state. They are updating the nomination because we obviously haven't had photos in a long time of all those properties. The descriptions are out of date. We find with a lot of our older nominations that properties got missed. So it just kind of skips over buildings sometimes. And so it just needs an update, and that makes it easier for folks when they're applying for tax credits and things. It's just easier for us to look things up and refer to things. So Abilene, they had a local historic homes association for years and years and years who was gathering all this information on historic houses in town, but the files were like in somebody's basement. And they realized that this is not very useful for anybody, so they hired a consultant a couple years ago to scan all the files, take photographs and everything out of the files, and upload them to KHRI, which is our online database that we maintain. And it's open and accessible to the public. So now all of that information is accessible to the public. And if anybody has a question about a historic house in Abilene, it's a lot easier to find that now. And then this is the example I was telling you about. They actually did a window repair workshop in Topeka first, and then the vinyl removal workshop in 2019. They were going to do a plaster repair workshop in 2020, but it fell through. Should have brought in a drink. Douglas County worked with Lawrence to do a cemetery conservation workshop. And so it was a 2-day workshop where Pishney Restoration came in. The first day told us all about how to restore grave markers. And then we went out to the cemetery, did some hands-on work. And then the second day did some other things like resetting the stones and learning how to safely do all that. And part of the grant was that they hired a videographer to video the whole thing and produce a series of YouTube videos. And so anything that you can do like that where you can make something publicly accessible or to the benefit of the public is even better. So we paid for the grant workshop, but then we also paid for the videographer. So now if you all have questions about cemeteries, you can just go on YouTube and watch it. I mentioned archaeology earlier, and one of the projects we did in the early 2000s was the city of Manhattan. Oh, thank you. Bless your heart. Oh, she was listening. So the city of Manhattan was, there's a creek called Wildcat Creek, and there was a lot of development pressure along that creek. Housing developments, developers wanting to, put in new developments. And they knew that there was probably some archaeological resources out there, especially with the university. Professors at the university had always been interested in that area for field schools and things like that. And so to try to head off problems, it's never a good day when you've got the excavator out and they dig into something and, oh my gosh, there's bones or something, right? So they want to avoid that. They did a survey of potential archaeological sites along the creek. That way they can map it and know where they are, and then the planning department can divert developers away from those areas, right? They listed some of them in the National Register so that they have some protection. But mostly it was just a survey to try to direct development in their community. That's helped a lot. It doesn't necessarily have to be like paper type projects. We can use this money for physical assessments, conditions assessments, recommendations, like coming up with a preservation plan for a particular property. Usually these are more community-based properties like the county courthouse or a depot at the top right. The one on the top left is a art garden in Lucas. But sometimes properties need a little bit of help just coming up with construction documents or developing a scope of work, a budget. It has to be a National Register listed property, but otherwise we can fund that kind of project too. And then these are examples of preservation plans that different communities have done. Like I said, they're part of their comprehensive plan a lot of time, or they're incorporated, and they just kind of give them a roadmap of where they're going and how they want to get there. Potential historic districts that they might want to work on, survey areas, that kind of thing. Couple of things to just think about too, is that CLGs are allowed to pool funding to share with other CLGs. So if Leavenworth and Olathe wanted to get together and host a conference, one of you could be designated as the administrator of the grant, but you could pool your resources and both share the match. It's a lot of times used for things like that, like workshops and conferences. Other things would be for like staffing. So if there was a particular project or something, or the community just needed staffing for the commission, you could hire a contractor to do that, and you could even share that with another community if you needed to. And then third-party administration is where a sub-grant, it is administered by someone else. So a university, a preservation organization, the Main Street program. The city signs off on the application, and we get to count that as our pass-through. So that's good for me. And then it's good for the city because they don't necessarily have to be the one to administer the grant. It would be the Downtown Development Organization or the Historical Society or the university that would do that for you. It helps a lot with things like surveys and things like that where you just maybe don't have the staff time to administer the grant. In other states, I've heard about these other projects, and these are just ideas where Maryland did a pass-through grant for energy audits to help kind of promote preservation in the realm of green energy and things. Because a lot of times, you guys probably hear this too, people are like, oh, I have to replace my windows for energy efficiency. Well, there's some truth to that, but not as much as you would think. There's a lot of energy being lost through other things, not the windows. So doing an energy audit shows folks where they are losing energy in their home and where they can make changes that would be more return on investment instead of replacing windows. Community Development Block Grant is some of the only federal money that can match other federal money. And so because my grant is federal funding, this grant can also match a Historic Preservation Fund. So if the city does have a CDBG grant for something and is looking for a match that meets both requirements, we can do that. So like a facade improvement program, they do this in Iowa, a community or neighborhood sort of facilitation of some kind of, mass facade project or something like that. Hiring an engineer to come in and look at all these facades on your downtown to make sure that they're structurally sound or something like that would be a project. Our state preservation conference is going to happen this year. It did not happen last year. It's scheduled for September 9th through the 11th in Pittsburgh. We are going to do in person, barring any more pandemics. We imagine that there will be also some sort of streaming component to it, so if you can't make it in person, there'll be something probably that you can at least watch online. But if that's something that you would like to attend in person, let us know, and we can talk about scholarships. Usually registration isn't very much, like $100, but I know the travel and lodging and stuff like that can sometimes add up, so. We can pay for basically everything except for food. As I mentioned, the applications are gonna be developed late in 21. They'll be put out and then due in about March and awarded in May. And then if you guys have any questions about anything, you can always contact me. If you guys have any projects, you know, ideas that you come up with, things that you need, feel like there would be a benefit to the community that's preservation related, feel free to toss them out there because the grant program is pretty wide open as far as the Park Service loves new ideas. So if I tossed an idea out to them and said, hey, would this be eligible? And if there's any way to make it eligible, they will try it.
I know I'm with First Presbyterian Church here, and we've done a number of grants and tax credits particularly, but we have never been able to crack the code on the HPF.
Well, HPF is for cities mostly.
But there is a historical fund that's. for
Heritage
individual-
Trust Fund.
Okay.
Heritage Trust Fund, yeah. The Heritage Trust Fund is what we call a bricks and mortar grant. It's a state grant. And it's for physical work on buildings or historic properties. The code, as you're saying, is really just the competitive nature of it because we usually.
Because we're having to replace all the cornices
Yeah,
completely around
Yeah.
the building. That's $150,000.
right.
And we're right in the middle of that.
You and everybody else, and that's the problem. We usually have between $4 and $5 million requested, and we have less than $1 million to give out every year. So even if every single person that applies has the best application ever, we only have $1 million to give out, and so the grant committee has to every year make a
And
decision.
what's the time frame on that as far as?
That one, applications should be out this month, and then they're due in November, and awards are in February.
Okay.
Yeah. We actually did get a little bit of extra money this year from the feds for a particular grant called the Kansas Rural Preservation Grant. It was a grant that we had to apply for from the feds, and we applied with the idea that we were going to supplement the Heritage Trust Fund. Because we have about $1 million to give out there, we got another $500,000 to give out. That $500,000 had to go to communities less than 30,000 because they had to be rural, which is most of Kansas, but that's okay. So we had an extra $500,000, but we awarded 15 grants to that, and we awarded like 15 grants to HTF, and then that was the $1.5 million. That was it. So out of probably 60 or 70 applications, we awarded 30. Yeah, actually we had like 62, I think, of the rural, and we awarded 15. I think the Heritage Trust Fund had like 47. We awarded 15. Yeah, that's the problem with those. Yeah.
Well, thanks for
You guys have
coming.
been trained up. We were talking about one of the requirements of the Preservation Commission is you guys are supposed to have a training at least once a year. So you three
We're done.
you're done. Yep.
So does that mean we're well preserved now? Is that what you may have just said to us?
You're well preserved.
I think so.
Sherry and Ken are
Not
on
me.
the
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I was telling Julie and Michelle earlier too, if, next year or later this year or something, you guys have a small meeting with maybe, no agenda items or one agenda item, you can always pull up a YouTube video or something and watch that as a commission and count that as training or something too, so. Or come to the preservation conference or go to NAPC
Yeah.
or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks for
Thank
training.
you
All
very
right,
much.
you're very
Thank you,
welcome.
really.
Thanks for,
Thanks.
You have better weather to travel in today.
Yeah.
yeah, right.